Hi viewers, in this video I will show you how I troubleshoot the ABS system, fixed the ABS control module, replaced two broken brake lines, and bled the ABS brake system.
Not long ago, the ABS and the ESP amber warning lights stayed on after starting the engine. The illumination was amber instead of red, so it was still possible to use the brakes, but the ABS and the ESP functions were cancelled. Usually, when these warning lights are turned on, it means that the ABM electronic system generated and stored one or more trouble codes. Because the ABS system is part of the chassis components, the code should begin with the letter C. In this case, the code was stored as C2116. The code description was ABS pump motor supply, low voltage. Before replacing any parts, I decided to inspect the current continuity from the battery terminals up to the positive and the negative contact sockets of the ABM harness connector. This is the 40 amp fuse that is part of the circuit. It is used to protect the ABS module electrical and electronic components. The fuse is located in the TPM assembly and the fuse reference number is 35. It was old, so I replaced it with a known good one. Next, I removed the air intake duct to gain access to the battery terminals. Then I disconnected and isolated the negative and the positive battery terminals. After, I brushed and cleaned the main electrical contacts of the terminals. The secondary contacts were also disassembled and cleaned. With this electrical design, the battery positive current flows up to the TPM positive terminal, and then it is distributed to many fuses, including the fuse number 35. From this fuse, the current flows to the contact socket number 17, located in the connector C11. If the TPM is unfastened and raised up a bit, there is enough room to unplug the connector. To inspect the contact pins and the contact sockets, I released the red sliding tab. Next, I depressed the green locking tab. Then, I pulled up the white retaining lever to disconnect the connector from the TPM. I visually inspected the contact socket number 17. Then, I used the small mirror to inspect the contact pin number 17. These electrical contacts were not oxidized, but to improve them, I sprayed some contact cleaner. The other end of the red and blue wire was crimped into the contact socket number 1 of the ABM harness connector. This is the harness connector connected to the ABM board-to-cable connector. The complete assembly can be called ABS module or integrated control unit. It is made of these components: the anti-lock brake module and the hydraulic control unit with a non-serviceable pump motor. These 6 brake lines are connected to the HCU with tube nuts, and they are routed with brake line holders. Since the problem was probably caused by a defective HCU motor, I sprayed some penetrating fluid on the tube nuts to remove the ABS module later. Next, I disconnected the ABM harness connector to inspect it. This is the contact socket that gets the 12-volt current from the ABS pump fuse. I checked the continuity between the contact socket and the fuse number 35. The result was fine. Later, I performed an electrical load test with a 12-volt bulb, and there was no obvious voltage drop. There was also no short to ground. Next, I cleaned the contacts between the chassis ground G110 and the ground cable eyelet. When the eyelet was reconnected, I tested the continuity between the ABM harness connector contact socket number 47 and the negative battery terminal. The resistance was 0 ohm. I also performed the same test with the contact socket number 16, and the resistance was still 0 ohm. Later, I did a load test with a light bulb, and there was no visible voltage drop. To check if there was a problem with the pump motor or the PCB board of the ABS module, I had to remove the complete assembly. To be proactive, I sprayed more penetrating fluid on the rusty parts. The next day, I converted the bar clamp to use it as a brake pedal depressor. The brake pedal needs to be depressed more than 1 inch and held in position. This keeps the brake fluid in the reservoir of the master cylinder when the brake line is disconnected or cut. Then it was time to loosen the tube nuts from the hydraulic control unit. I began with the secondary brake line coming from the master cylinder. The tube nut was so tight that even if I was using a 12 mm flare nut wrench, I was partially stripping it. I used my custom tools to solve the problem. Then I easily unseized all the tube nuts from the threaded ports. In fact, my main problem was caused by the nylon coating applied around the brake lines. Because of the rust, the nylon coating was crushed and fully seized between these tube nuts and the brake lines. Up north, many parts are rusty due to the salt that is applied on icy roads during winter. The penetrating fluid had no effect at all and wasn't able to loosen these parts. So I had no choice. I had to hold these brake lines with my brake line pliers while I was undoing the tube nuts. Sadly, I was out of luck with these two lines, because they twisted and broke. Next, I removed the heat shield to allow moving the brake line later on. Without the shield, I was also able to unfasten the broken brake lines. These bundle routing clips can be pulled from the dash panel studs when needed. Next, I disconnected this bracket to loosen the power steering hose. Then I used these custom pliers to spread out some routing clips holding the brake lines. At last, the ABM connector was disconnected, and these bracket mounting bolts were loosened. I maneuvered and removed the ABS module and the bracket together. Since I had to buy two used brake lines from a U-pull facility nearby, I also decided to get a used compatible ABS module while I was there. The parts I found came from a 2008 Jeep Compass, and they were compatible with my 2009 Jeep Patriot. The left front brake line that I bought was the same model as the one I had. But instead of getting the secondary brake line from the master cylinder, I bought the primary brake line because I wanted to refit and adjust it in front of the brake line bundle. This is the part number that was compatible. This one is my 2009 ABS module. Since I had a spare one, I decided to clean it and check some inner electrical contacts. This is how it looked when it was cleaned. I checked it without the bracket and I didn't see any visible damage. Next, I refitted the bracket to hold the assembly with the bench vise. The ABM electronic components are sealed behind this cover. The cover was bonded with heavy-bodied seam sealer. First, I made a groove in the side seam with the point of a knife. Then I widened it with the opposite side of the blade. When there was enough space, I used a small metal saw blade to remove more seam sealer all around the plastic cover. I found a weak spot with a flathead screwdriver. Then I safely loosened and removed the cover. Some problems with old PCB boards are caused by bad contacts with solderless header pins. This can be due to pitting corrosion spots that are difficult to see when the contact pins are very small. I also checked the foreground solderless pins and they look fine. The other thing I wanted to do was to check the resistance of the DC motor. To be able to compare the resistance of some circuits between the two modules, I also removed the cover from the 2008 module. There was also no visible trace of corrosion on the solderless pins used to energize the DC motor and the valves. Next, I was interested in knowing what was the resistance of the two DC motors. At first, I tested the resistance of the motor from my original ABS module with a multimeter. I used one probe to touch the transistor leg, then I touched the ground pins with the other probe. The average resistance was around 20 ohms with these 4 pins. Because the problem with the original assembly was probably caused by a bad DC motor, I decided to assemble the 2008 hydraulic control unit with the 2009 anti-lock brake module. When it was done, I checked the new resistance and the average reading was 3.2 ohms. I considered this value acceptable. Note, the Jeep technicians must replace the stem seals and the O-ring when the ABS module is reassembled. I applied a bead of RTV silicone on the edges of the housing to seal the cover and protect the electronic components. As you remember, I broke 2 brake lines earlier, so they had to be replaced. I had to remove many parts to do it. First, the air filter components. Then the PCM. These are T25 torque screws that I undid. I also disconnected the PCM connectors. I removed the PCM and I cleaned it later. Because the front left brake line was routed under this support, I had to remove more parts. The PCM holder, the battery tray, and the air filter box mounting bracket. Then I was able to reach the brake line, but I wanted more space to work and film. So I unclipped the tip-M and I moved it aside. To remove the tip-M plastic shield, I had to cut these 2 cable ties. At that moment, there was enough space to replace the 2 broken brake lines. This is one of the clips holding the front left brake line, and this is a rubber grommet to protect the line. Here we can see the other side of the grommet near the hose coupling. Previously, I sprayed some penetrating fluid on the rusty parts like the tube nut and the banjo fitting. Because this brake line had to be replaced, I didn't worry about damaging the end of the line. First, I loosened the tube nut with a flare nut wrench. Then I undid the tube nut with a common wrench. After, I let the excess of brake fluid dripping from the line. To avoid contaminating the brake fluid in the flex hose, I plugged the hose fitting with a compatible bolt. This was the first broken brake line I had to remove. The brake line was routed under the coolant hose and behind the fuel line hose. When I disconnected the brake line, a part of the routing clip broke because it was old. I pushed the grommet on the other side to gain more space to remove the brake line. Then I was able to transfer this end of the line in the engine bay. After, I moved the brake line in this location. But I had to fold some sections of the line to be able to get it out in a single piece. This is the broken brake line beside the used one. Next, I had to undo the tube nut of the secondary brake line that was attached to the master cylinder. Luckily, the tube nut was easy to undo. I found it difficult to unclip and remove the secondary brake line from behind the brake line bundle in one piece, so I cut it in 2 sections to ease the work. Not long after, I maneuvered and fitted the brake line in place. Later, I replaced this cable tie with a new routing clip. After that, I routed and positioned the secondary brake line in front of the brake line bundle. I used a crowfoot wrench with a small torque wrench to tighten the tube nuts to specs. Few minutes later, I positioned and secured the ABS module in place. At that time, none of these tube nuts were fastened. To prevent the dust from falling from the heat mat and contaminating the brake fluid in the module, I covered this section of the mat with green masking tape. It was easier for me to refit and tighten the 6 tube nuts in this order. The last tube nut was difficult to fit properly because I had to refold and align many sections of the brake line to obtain a good routing. Finally, the brake line was attached to the hydraulic unit and to the master cylinder. After, I jacked up the entire vehicle and I removed the wheels to easily reach the brake bleeder valves. To remove the air from the brake lines and the hydraulic control unit, I did perform 3 bleeding steps. Step 1. Bleeding the base brake system can be described as bleeding the non-ABS portion of the brake system. Step 2. Bleeding the hydraulic control unit using the ABS function of my bidirectional scan tool. Step 3. Bleeding the base brake system again to eliminate some tiny air bubbles. So to begin, I performed the step 1 brake bleeding with the help of an assistant. I didn't film this procedure because it is described in many YouTube videos. Note: after the step 1 bleeding, the brake pedal can still be spongy if the HCU contains air pockets. Following the bleeding steps, it is important to look for any brake fluid leaks and solve the problem if need be. Next, I had to reassemble many parts and reconnect the electrical system. The main parts were the air filter box mounting bracket, the tip-in plastic shield, the cable ties, the tip-in assembly, the battery tray, the PCM bracket, the PCM connectors, the air filter components, the vent tube, and the battery. I double-checked all the connectors to confirm they were properly connected. While the shifter was in park position, I started the engine and I let it run for about 2 minutes. During that time, the ABS light and the ESP light turned off. Before bleeding the hydraulic control unit, I checked the brake fluid level again, and I connected a small battery charger to maintain a basic voltage during the bleeding procedure. I also installed a bleeding tube and a cash bottle on each bleeder screw located on the right side of the vehicle. Only the bleeding valves on the right side are needed to bleed the primary and the secondary hydraulic circuits in the HCU system. Then I connected my bidirectional scan tool to clear the ABS fault codes stored in the ABM. To bleed the module, I selected Service from the Home menu. Then I selected Brake Bleed from the Service menu. In the vehicle brand selection, I selected Jeep. In the Select Diagnostic Type, I selected Automatic Selection. Then, in the Acquire VIN Information menu, I selected Read. The proper VIN number was displayed, so I pressed OK. Then, in the Confirm Vehicle Profile, I pressed Yes. In the main menu, I selected Hot Functions. After, in the Bleed Brake menu, I pressed Bleed Brakes ABS. In the Information menu, I read and followed the instructions. Yes, I bled the brakes manually when I performed the step 1 bleeding. The level of the brake fluid was also fine, and I was ready to press the brake pedal. I pressed OK. Then this procedure was displayed on screen. Open the right front bleeder valve, press the brake pedal, and then press OK to continue. The bleeder hose was already installed, and I told my assistant to open the right front bleeder valve. When it was confirmed, I pressed the brake pedal and I kept it down. Then I pressed OK. After, when the please wait message was displayed, I could hear and feel the HCU hydraulic pump functioning 5 times in a row. When the procedure was completed, another procedure was displayed. Close the right front bleeder valve, press OK to continue. I told my assistant to close the bleeder valve, and when it was confirmed, I pressed OK. The following information was displayed. Open the right rear bleeder valve, press the brake pedal, and then press OK to continue. I told my assistant to open the right rear bleeder valve, and it was confirmed. I was still keeping the brake pedal down because of this previous message. I pressed OK to continue. Again, when the please wait message was displayed, I could hear and feel the HCU hydraulic pump functioning. When the procedure was completed, this other procedure was displayed. Close the right rear bleeder valve, press OK to continue. I told my assistant to close the bleeder valve. When it was confirmed, I pressed OK to continue. Then the message "Evac and fill completed" was displayed. I released the brake pedal and I pressed OK. Finally, the step 2 was completed. I tested the brake pedal and it was not spongy anymore. Then I turned off the scan tool and I disconnected it. After, I didn't find any brake fluid leak. Again, I adjusted the level of the brake fluid. Few minutes later, my assistant and I performed a regular brake bleeding without filming it. It was the step 3 bleeding. Once done, I reassembled the rest of the parts. I also improved the base of the heat shield to be suitable with the new routing of the secondary brake line. When all the parts, including the 4 wheels, were installed, I lowered the vehicle. Later on, I tested the ABS and ESP functions on icy roads, and they were working properly.
Buying a used ABS module instead of a fully functional one was a risk, but I succeeded. Normally, to fix this kind of problem, people should have the expertise and the proper tools.